Welcome, brave souls. I am your guide into the realm of the unknown. Here, among these ancient tombstones and whispering trees, we uncover the most intriguing and terrifying stories that will send shivers down your spine. Encounter the supernatural in real life. Each story will transport you to a world where fear reigns and the line between the living and the dead blurs. Are you ready to face your fears? Let the stories begin. The night was as black as ink, with not a star in the sky, when the crew of the Serpent's Wrath sailed into the uncharted waters of the North Atlantic. They were seasoned ocean explorers, a group of 6 who had braved the darkest corners of the world's oceans in search of treasure, history, and adventure. Led by Captain James Thornton, a man with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue, the crew had seen it all, or so they thought. The Serpent's Wrath was a sturdy vessel, built to withstand the ferocity of the ocean. But as they ventured deeper into the unknown, a thick fog began to roll in, engulfing the ship in a dense, suffocating blanket. The crew could barely see their hands in front of their faces. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist. "Steady as she goes," Captain Thornton muttered, gripping the wheel with white-knuckled determination. His eyes scanned the horizon, or what little he could see of it, for any signs of danger. But it wasn't danger he found. It was something far worse. Out of the fog, looming like a specter from another world, appeared the silhouette of a massive ship. It was an ancient galleon, its sails tattered and torn, its hull weathered by centuries of exposure to the elements. The ship's name, barely visible in the dim light, was etched in gold letters on the bow. The Leviathan. "That's impossible," whispered Tom, the ship's first mate, as he peered through his binoculars. "That ship is supposed to be lost at sea." The legend of the Leviathan was one of the most infamous maritime tales in history. It was said to be a cursed vessel, a ghost ship that had vanished without a trace over 200 years ago. Its crew had reportedly gone mad, turning on each other in a fit of bloodlust, slaughtering one another in a frenzy of violence. The ship was never found, and its story became the stuff of nightmares. Yet here it was, in the flesh, or rather in the wood and iron, sitting ominously in the fog, as if waiting for them. "Prepare to board," Captain Thornton ordered, his voice betraying no fear, though a cold dread had settled in his gut. The crew, armed with ropes and grappling hooks, hesitated for only a moment before obeying. They were explorers, after all, and the thrill of discovery outweighed their trepidation. But as they climbed aboard the Leviathan, they quickly realized that they had made a grave mistake. The deck of the ship was eerily silent, the only sound the creaking of the wood beneath their boots. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and a cold wind seemed to whisper through the sails, carrying with it a faint, mournful cry. "What happened here?" whispered Sarah, the ship's navigator, as she gazed at the splintered planks and broken masts. There were no bodies in sight, but the signs of violence were unmistakable. Bloodstains covered the deck, long dried to a dark, rusty brown. Deep gashes were carved into the wood, as if made by desperate hands clawing for survival. "I don't like this," muttered Lucas, the ship's engineer, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. He had always been the most superstitious of the crew, and the atmosphere on the Leviathan was pushing him to the edge. "Stay together," Captain Thornton ordered, his eyes scanning the shadows. "We'll search the ship and get out of here. We're not alone on this vessel." They moved cautiously, sticking close to one another as they explored the ghostly ship. The lower decks were a maze of narrow corridors and cramped cabins, each one more decrepit than the last. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the air grew colder, heavy with the scent of rot. It was in the captain's cabin that they found the first body. Captain Thornton pushed open the door, revealing a room shrouded in darkness. The only light came from a flickering lantern that hung from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The room was in disarray, with maps and charts strewn across the floor, but it was the figure slumped over the desk that drew their attention. The man was dressed in tattered, blood-stained clothes, his face hidden beneath a thick layer of grime. But as Captain Thornton approached, he saw the unmistakable signs of a violent death. The man's throat had been slashed, a deep, jagged wound that had nearly severed his head from his body. Blood had pooled beneath him, staining the wooden floor. "Dear God," whispered Sarah, her hand covering her mouth. "Who could have done this?" "It's the curse," Lucas muttered, his eyes darting around the room. "The curse of the Leviathan. They say the ship drives men mad, makes them kill each other." "Nonsense," snapped Captain Thornton, though even he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. It's just a tragedy. The crew must have turned on each other. We'll find out what happened here, and then we'll leave." But as they continued their search, it became clear that the situation was far more sinister than they had imagined. The bodies they found, what little was left of them, had been mutilated beyond recognition. Limbs had been hacked off, torsos disemboweled, and faces slashed to ribbons. The violence was almost incomprehensible, as if the crew had been driven to a state of pure animalistic rage. Yet there were no signs of struggle, no weapons, no signs of a fight. It was as if the crew had simply gone mad and torn each other apart with their bare hands. But that wasn't the worst of it. In the bowels of the ship, in a hidden chamber that had been sealed off for centuries, they found something that defied explanation. The chamber was small, barely large enough to stand in, and lined with strange, ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie glow. In the center of the room was a stone altar, stained with old, dried blood, and lying on that altar was a book. The book was bound in what looked like human skin, its pages yellowed with age and covered in spidery, black writing. The language was unfamiliar, the characters twisted and distorted, as if they had been written by a hand that was not entirely human. Captain Thornton reached out to touch the book, but as his fingers brushed the cover, a shock of cold ran through him, freezing him in place. He could feel something, a presence watching him from the shadows, its eyes boring into his soul. "Don't touch it," Lucas hissed, grabbing his arm. "That book, it's evil. I can feel it." But it was too late. The moment Captain Thornton touched the book, the ship began to shudder, as if something deep within it had been awakened. The fog outside thickened, swirling around the ship like a living entity, and the temperature dropped even further, the cold seeping into their bones. "We need to get out of here," Sarah urged, her voice trembling. "This ship, it's alive, it's feeding off us." But before they could move, the door to the chamber slammed shut, trapping them inside. The lantern flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. And then the voices began. Whispers, low and insidious, filled the chamber, coming from all directions at once. They spoke in that same strange language, their words like nails scraping against the inside of their skulls. The crew clutched their heads, trying to block out the sound, but the voices only grew louder, more insistent. "They're coming," Lucas gasped, his eyes wide with terror. "The spirits of the crew, they're coming for us." And then, as if summoned by his words, the shadows in the room began to move. They twisted and coiled, taking on vaguely human shapes, their eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. The shadows reached out with clawed hands, their touch cold and clammy, like the grip of death itself. "Fight them," Captain Thornton shouted, drawing his knife and slashing at the nearest shadow. But his blade passed through it, as if it were made of smoke, and the shadow only laughed, a chilling, hollow sound. One by one, the crew was dragged into the darkness, their screams echoing through the chamber. Lucas was the first to go, his body convulsing as the shadows tore at his flesh, stripping it away layer by layer. Sarah was next, her throat slashed open by an invisible blade, her blood splattering across the walls. Tom tried to fight, but the shadows overwhelmed him, their claws ripping into his chest, tearing out his heart and holding it aloft as a trophy. Captain Thornton watched in horror as his crew was slaughtered before his eyes, their bodies reduced to little more than blood and bone. But the shadows didn't stop there. They turned on him, their eyes glowing with hunger, and he knew that there was no escape. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the book on the altar, its pages fluttering as if in a breeze. The symbols glowed with an unholy light, and the whispers grew louder, more frenzied, until they were all he could hear. And then, with a final, agonized scream, Captain Thornton was gone. The Leviathan was silent once more, the ship adrift in the fog. As the chilling echoes of the last tale linger in the air, let us delve into another shadowy corner of the night, where the unknown waits with bated breath. Gather your courage, for the next story begins. It was a warm summer evening in 1943 when the SS Argonaut set sail from the New York harbor, bound for England. A sturdy freighter with a seasoned crew of 30 men, the ship was well equipped to face the challenges of the open sea. Captain Elias Harper, a man in his late 40s with a reputation for fearlessness, stood at the helm, his eyes scanning the horizon as the sun dipped below the waterline. The voyage was uneventful for the first few days. The men went about their duties with the efficiency of those who had spent years at sea. But on the 5th day, as they sailed through the North Atlantic, a dense fog descended upon the ship. The fog was unlike anything they had ever seen, thick, impenetrable, and eerily silent. The Argonaut seemed to be swallowed by it, the world outside the ship disappearing into a gray void. For hours they sailed blindly, the ship's foghorn bellowing into the nothingness. But there was no response, no sign of life, no sound but the mournful wail of the foghorn and the creaking of the ship. As night fell, the crew grew increasingly uneasy. The fog was unnatural, oppressive, as if it had a will of its own. Then, without warning, the ship's engines died. The Argonaut drifted aimlessly in the fog, the crew scrambling to figure out what had happened. But before they could make any sense of the situation, a bone-chilling scream echoed from the bowels of the ship. The crew rushed below deck, following the sound of the scream. What they found was beyond comprehension. Ensign Samuel Hayes, a young man barely out of his teens, was sprawled on the floor, his throat slashed open, blood pooling around him. His eyes were wide with terror, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. Panic spread through the crew like wildfire. Who could have done this, and why? The ship was in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by an impenetrable fog. There was no one else on board but the crew. Captain Harper took control of the situation, ordering the men to search the ship for any intruders. But the search turned up nothing. No sign of a struggle, no sign of anyone who didn't belong. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air. As the night wore on, the tension aboard the Argonaut grew unbearable. The men were jumpy, paranoid, suspecting each other of the murder. But Captain Harper was determined to keep control. He ordered everyone to stay together in the mess hall until morning, hoping that daylight would bring some clarity. But the night had other plans. As the crew huddled together in the mess hall, the ship began to groan and creak as if under some immense pressure. The temperature dropped rapidly, their breath misting in the air. And then the whispering began. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the ship, but soon it grew louder, more insistent. Voices, dozens of them, whispering in languages none of the crew could understand. The men looked around wildly, trying to find the source of the voices, but there was nothing, no one, just the suffocating fog pressing in on them from all sides. Then one of the crewmen, A burly man named Thompson snapped. He leapt to his feet, screaming that the voices were inside his head, clawing at his skull, trying to get out. Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed a knife from the table and plunged it into his own chest, over and over, until he collapsed in a pool of blood. The crew was paralyzed with fear. 2 men were dead, and the rest were teetering on the edge of madness. Captain Harper tried to maintain order, but the whispers were relentless, gnawing at the sanity of the men. By dawn, 3 more were dead, one by his own hand, the others murdered in their sleep. As the fog lifted slightly with the morning light, the crew discovered something horrifying. Carved into the wooden planks of the deck, in what appeared to be blood, were strange symbols. Symbols that none of them recognized, but that filled them with a deep, primal dread. The ship itself seemed to be changing, the corridors longer, the rooms darker, the walls pulsating as if alive. The men could feel something watching them, something ancient and malevolent. Desperation gripped the crew. They tried to get the engines running, to signal for help, but nothing worked. The ship was dead in the water, and so were they. That night, the entity revealed itself. The air grew heavy, charged with an unnatural energy. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they coalesced into a single booming voice that seemed to come from all directions at once. "You are mine." The lights flickered and then went out, plunging the ship into darkness. In the blackness, the entity moved, a shadow within shadows, unseen but felt. The men screamed as it passed through them, a cold, malevolent presence that sapped their strength, their will to live. One by one, the crew was picked off, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. The entity was toying with them, feeding off their fear, their pain. Captain Harper tried to fight it, but his weapons were useless against something that wasn't entirely of this world. In the end, only 2 men were left, Harper and the ship's first mate, William Reeves. They barricaded themselves in the captain's quarters, hoping to hold out until the morning. But morning never came. Time seemed to have lost all meaning. The sun did not rise, and the ship remained trapped in the fog, drifting in an endless night. Harper and Reeves could feel the entity pressing in on them, its whispers now a constant drone in their minds. It was then that the voice spoke directly to them, not in whispers, but in a language they could understand. "Your lives for passage. Accept, and you will be spared." Harper and Reeves looked at each other, their faces pale and drawn. They knew there was no escape, no fighting this thing. But Harper, ever the leader, refused to surrender. He shouted defiantly into the darkness, cursing the entity, vowing to fight to the bitter end. But Reeves was broken. He had seen too much, lost too much. He just wanted the nightmare to end. So, he made the pact. As soon as he uttered the words, the entity took him. Harper watched in horror as Reeves's body contorted, his skin splitting open as something dark and twisted crawled out from inside him. The creature, a grotesque parody of a man, smiled at Harper with rows of razor-sharp teeth. "Your turn, Captain." And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog lifted. The Argonaut reappeared in the middle of the Atlantic, drifting aimlessly. A passing cargo ship spotted the freighter and sent out a distress signal. When the rescue team boarded the Argonaut, they found it eerily silent, the deck covered in blood. In the captain's quarters, they found Elias Harper, alive but barely. He was clutching a rusted, blood-stained knife, his eyes wild with terror. The rescuers tried to question him, but all he could do was mutter incoherently about the fog, the voices, and the pact. The Argonaut was towed to port, and the authorities were baffled by the ship's condition. It looked as if it had been abandoned for decades, the metal corroded, the wood rotting. But the ship's log was intact, detailing the voyage up until the moment they entered the fog. Harper was taken to a psychiatric facility, where he remained catatonic for years, the trauma of what he had witnessed too much for his mind to bear. But one night, 80 years after the Argonaut had disappeared, he spoke. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he whispered to the nurse on duty. "It was only one day in the fog." When the nurse asked him what he meant, Harper's eyes locked onto hers, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "Reeves is still out there. He's waiting for me. He's waiting for all of us." The nurse shivered as a cold draft swept through the room. Harper's eyes rolled back into his head, and he let out a blood-curdling scream, his body convulsing violently. The lights in the room flickered, and for a brief moment the nurse saw a shadow, a dark figure standing behind Harper, its eyes glowing with malevolent intent. And then, just as suddenly, Harper went still. The room fell silent, the shadow gone. The nurse backed away slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The next morning, Harper was found dead in his bed, his body twisted into an unnatural position, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. The doctors could find no cause of death, but the nurse knew. She had seen the shadow, felt its presence. The Argonaut was sealed off, deemed too dangerous to explore further. But rumors began to spread among the sailors, whispers of a cursed ship that had reappeared after 80 years, its crew driven mad by something in the fog. And somewhere out in the endless expanse of the ocean, the fog still waits, the entity within hungry. So, brave souls, our journey in the shadows is coming to an end for tonight. We hope that these stories have stirred your imagination and given you goosebumps. Remember, the world is full of secrets waiting to be discovered, and the line between reality and the supernatural is thinner than you might think. If you enjoyed today's stories and want to hear more creepy and unexplained, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you will be the first to know about new stories of horror and intrigue. Click on the bell icon so you don't miss a single creepy story. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and remember, some doors are better left unopened.